Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How's that lunch? Let's give a warm round of applause to the Hilton for a great lunch and a great venue for us today. Really appreciate that. So my name is Nick Kaufman. I'm a land use planner with the engineering firm of WGM Group here in Missoula, and I have the privilege of being your MC today. So I'd like to run through just a little bit, first off, what we're going to do today and why it's so important, and we'll move into a different part of the program. So we want to talk about wildfire, and I want to always start with the history of wildfire. So who was around in 1952, cognizant of what was going on in 1952? Don't be shy, all right? So in 1952, we have our first recognition of wildfires and their impact in the United States. And we're introduced to a gentleman named Smokey Bear, all right? How many are familiar with Smokey Bear, all right? So if you were a Boy Scout or a grade school, you might have had Sister Mary Maloney sing you the song, Smokey Bear. And we're not gonna do that today, but ever since then, you know, when I was young, I never played with matches because of Smokey Bear. Today there are no matches, so the message is just a little different from Smokey, but we have changed our culture in terms of how we occupy our national forests and how we occupy wildlands, where we occupy wildlands, and we're going to talk today about the economics of that. We're going to talk about how decisions are made regarding that, and I think we've got a great panel for you. So here's some facts. So in the 1990s, the average cost of federal wildfire protection and suppression was less than $1 billion annually. Wildfires are getting larger and causing more damage. The 6 worst fire seasons since 1960 have happened since the year 2000. Since 2002, the cost of federal wildfire protection and suppression has averaged more than $3 billion a year. Okay? Wildfire protection now accounts for nearly 1/2 of the Forest Service budget and 10% of other federal agencies. So we asked the Forest Service to have Smokey Bear here today and out front. And what we found out when we asked him is there was no budget to have a personnel put the Smokey suit on and come to this particular event. They wouldn't rent us the Smokey suit. So here's the thing. In 1985, the federal government spent $240 million on fire suppression. What did the state of Montana spend on fire suppression in 2017? $226 million. Just the state of Montana spent nearly as much as the federal government did in 1985 for fire suppression. It's a big deal, right? Not only are we impacted by smoke and how it affects our health and how it affects tourism and monetarily, right? But when the state of Montana has to cut down specific programs that affect education and commerce in the state of Montana, we're affected that way too. So we're sending a lot of funds outside of dedicated, appropriate programs because of what we're spending on wildfires. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce the head table. I got to look at it first to make sure I know everybody that's there. And so Kim Luttrell, the CEO of the Missoula Chamber of Commerce. Hold your applause till the end. Tom Sievertson, President, First Interstate. You can stay standing, Kim. Right? And our title sponsor today, John Horner, Vice President of Commercial Lending at First Interstate Bank, is at the head table. Will Johnson, incoming chairman for the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce, is here. Seth Bodner, brand new president, University of Montana. Here, take a look at him. All right. Thanks for coming. Leanne Martin, Region 1 Forester. Hey, talk about your budget today. Scott Burke, President, First Security Bank. Ron Hooper, CEO, Neptune Aviation. And Steve Clausen, Manager for Northwestern Energy here in Missoula. Let's give him a warm round of applause. And then we got a couple people at the head table who have speaking roles coming up right directly. So I'd like to have John Horner, the Vice President of Commercial Lending for First Interstate Bank and the current Chairman of the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, Nick. Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate your being here. Hopefully what we talk about today will be informative and you will enjoy it and get a little bit of information out of it. First of all, I'd like to obviously thank our title sponsor, my employer, First Interstate Bank, and then thank as well our visionary members, First Security Bank, the Missoulian, the University of Montana, Northwestern Energy, and AT&T. Without the visionary members and without title sponsors and sponsorship from various entities, things like this would be tougher to put together. So we really appreciate that, and so we'd like to thank all of them. The next thing we'd like to do is start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you could all stand and face the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. The next thing I'd like to do is invite my boss, who also is the president of the Missoula market of First Interstate Bank, to come forward and say a few words. Tom, a few words. So Tom Severson.
I will not disappoint. Appreciate the opportunity to sponsor the state of Missoula again. Just a great event. I know we have a great slate of speakers here today, so I certainly won't bore you with me talking too much. So thanks again for everyone being here. Thanks to the chamber staff and the chamber board for getting this all put on. So thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, Tom, for being concise. Very good. All right, I want to tell you a little story. I was the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce back in 2015, and how many people came to the Paul McCartney concert about that year, all right? So Missoula is a wonderful community. It's all about quality of life, okay? And quality of life happens when we have healthy business. Healthy business supports our nonprofits, like local government, state of Montana, and the wonderful nonprofits who are the gatekeepers for our quality of life, right? It's our quality of life that allows the business people in this community to retain their employees and to hire new employees. And together, it's a wonderful symbiosis. And Missoula is the best place in Montana. Not the last best place, but the actual best place. So the evening of the Paul McCartney concert, I was up on the second floor of our building, which is on the Clark Fork River. And right across the Clark Fork River is a beautiful stadium at the University of Montana. And just downriver is the Van Buren Street footbridge, all right? Now, we call it a Chamber of Commerce Day, Kim, because there was a little haze in the air, because it was sort of the end of summer. But it was a little haze, all right? And so the sun was setting on the west side of the Van Buren Street footbridge, right? And it was casting this beautiful orange glow all the way down the Clark Fork River. And on the Clark Fork River were paddle boards and tubers and people swimming. And right at that moment, right at that magic moment when the sun was right there on the Van Buren Street Bridge, casting that glow on the river, Paul McCartney started his concert, right? Now that is our Missoula. That, to me, captured the whole spirit of what Missoula, Montana is about. This year, you wouldn't have been able to see the sun, and you wouldn't have been able to see the bridge, all right? So that's one of the impacts that smoke and wildfire have on our community. The great thing about Missoula, Montana is we work and operate as a team. We protect our quality of life as a team. That's what we did with our bond issues. And we get together when it comes to fire time and wildfire and how we respond to that. So in the fires of 2017, your Missoula Chamber of Commerce was called by the Forest Service because the Lolo fire was spreading out on two different fronts, the Highway 93 front and the US 12 front. And they needed a location for their command center, and they needed buildings for that command center. Called the Chamber of Commerce. Within 3 hours, the Chamber of Commerce had given them contacts for the buildings and structures that they needed, temporary structures, and also found a willing landowner to provide their location for their logistics. At the same time, the Missoula Area Fairgrounds, Emily Bentley, right, was taking animals who were being dislocated because of the fire, At the same time, our United Way, Susan Haypatrick and Bob Homer, right, were being called on to help and assist families that were being displaced by the fire. So we come together as a community in response to our disasters and to support our successes. And I can't say enough about Missoula, Montana, and how proud I am to be part of that. And you as well. All right, I'd like to introduce our head table. All right, so just to my right, Julia Altimus is the Executive Director of the Montana Woods Product Association. Her academic background is in economics and political science. She developed energy and natural resource policy as staff for the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. She was the Natural Resource Policy Director for the Montana Logging Association and the Montana State Forester. Julie is focused on sustaining Montana's forest products, infrastructure, and developing economic stability programs. She served on the Western Governor's Healthy Forest Advisory Committee, the National Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Advisory Committee, and currently serves on the U of M Bureau of Business and Economic Research Advisory Board. She is a member of the Montana Forest Products Retention Roundtable, the Montana Forest Collaborative Network, the Montana Forest Council, the Congressional Timber Task Force, and the Federal Forest Coalition. She has co-authored state and national publications, and Julia is a native Montana and has 3 grown children. So did I hear Sentinel, or did I hear Hellgate, or Hellgate? Very good, Julia, nice to have you here. Right next to Julia is Dr. Bryce Ward. All right. He's the founder of ABMJ Consulting and the Associate Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research here at the University of Montana. He has a PhD in economics from Harvard University and BAs in economics and history from the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. Right. Good to see Marcus Mariota this weekend. Well, we saw him the weekend before too. That was better. He has experience in urban and regional economics, labor economics, health economics, public finance, social economics, real estate economics, environmental and natural resource economics, and statistical econometrics. He has taught at the university level at a number of locations. He's published dozens of scholarly articles and economic reports. Other facts. He was the first person to use Facebook for scholarly research. I'd like to hear about that sometime, right? His former students include the founders of Facebook, Blue Apron, and Give Directly. He was once diagnosed with amnesia, but I've never asked you about it because I don't think you'd remember anything about it to start with. All right, other side of Bryce is Jack Cohen. We're envious of those of you that are retired down at the end of the table, by the way, but we'll get over it. So Jack is U.S. Forest Service retired. He's been involved in wildland fire research since 1972 and was a research scientist at the U.S. Forest Service fire laboratories here in Missoula, Montana, Riverside, California, and Macon, Georgia. He co-developed the U.S. National Fire Danger Rating System. Dr. Cohen has been interested in understanding the wildland-urban fire problem since the 1970s. He identified the limited area that principally determines structure ignition potential during extreme wildfires and developed the home ignition zone concept. That means what happens when a wildfire comes down close to structures, and what can you do to mitigate that? All right? There's the guy who developed it right there. He's applied this understanding to create the National Fire Protection Association's Assessing Structure Ignition Potential from Wildfire. He's done training in Firewise, the Firewise USA program. Dr. Cohen is retired from the U.S. Forest Service. He did it in 2016, but he continues his involvement in developing effective methods for preventing wildland urban fire disasters. How's that going for you?
Next.
No, thank you. All right. Other side of Jack is Tim Love. Tim is U.S. Forest Service retired. He served as a district ranger for Cedar Lake Ranger District on the Lolo National Forest for nearly 20 years. Tim started with the USDA Forest Service in 1975 and served in a variety of capacities on the Custer, Lewis and Clark, and Lolo National Forests. He served in the U.S. Air Force following high school, and wait a second, who'd you go to high school with? Kim Luttrell at Hellgate. There you go. All right. And then returned to his home in Missoula, Montana, where he received a bachelor's degree. Half of you's on the other page, Lathan. From the University of Montana, and is a certified forester with the Society of American Foresters. Tim remains active in forestry, has served on numerous community and nonprofit boards. His wife Donna is author of children's nature books. The couple have 3 grown children and 2 granddaughters. Please welcome our head table. All right, first up, Julia, are you ready?
Well, good morning, everybody. Justice, not quite as tall as Nick. Grab this. Thanks for the invitation to be here, and thanks for your interest in this issue, because wildfire affects everybody differently. There's a lot of issues that are the same, but for Wood Products Association, for timber in general, it definitely has a huge impact on us. And without the timber industry in the state of Montana, it would have a much larger impact on everybody in this room and everybody in the state of Montana as well. So I appreciate the interest, and I was asked to kind of give you a little bit of an update on the state of the industry in the state of Montana. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the association. We've only been around for about 46 years, but the first mill came into Montana back in the late 1800s. So forest products has been part of Montana's fabric for over 100 years. Did I lose? I lost it. Oh, there we go. That mill, a couple of the mills have since closed down, but the F.H. Stowe's Land and Lumber Company mill up in Columbia Falls has been around now, I think, 104 years. So long-time family-owned mill. We also, oh, that didn't actually work very well. Those are the major products that the industry represented with the association makes, but we also focus on state and federal issues and basically the business climate in the state of Montana, which obviously affects our members. So here's kind of where we're at. Do I need to advance that? No, okay. That's where the industry is located. Sorry, I'm gonna have to keep turning my head here. Across the state, and so it's a little bit hard to read, and I apologize for that, but we do have major, like the more than 10,000 or more than 10 million board foot mills, which you guys probably don't know what that means, but a board foot is basically a foot by an inch, and that's a board foot. So when we talk about 300 million board feet, then you can imagine what that is. And there's about 5,000 board feet on a logging truck. So if you have 1 million board feet, divide by 5,000, and you'll know how many logging trucks are going down the road. But we grow way more than that. We grow 7 times more trees in the state than we actually harvest. So our mill processing facilities, like I mentioned, we have about 12. This is from 2014, but it really has not changed until this year. The last mill that we lost was was the Stoltz, not the Stoltz, Smurfit Stone. Sorry, the Smurfit Stone mill out in Bonner was the last mill that actually would to close majorly. Then Weyerhaeuser closed a couple in 2016, but they maintained 3, so they still have a sawmill, a plywood plant, an MDF plant as well. So the current snapshot of the industry, and not all wood manufacturing belongs to the association. I wish they did, but they don't all. But there is about 160 primary, secondary, and value-added mills, or adding products to timber or to fiber. Hello? Did we lose it again?
We may have.
Hello? Oh, there we go. We're back.
Also, it's my energy, Julia.
It was probably me. There's about 7,300 people that are employed in this business. That's from logging contractors to foresters to the mills to the value-added folks and the Montana railing people that rely on the fact that we have an industry in the state of Montana. In 2017, we harvested about 367 million board feet of timber, but that's on all landowners. So that's federal, state, private, and tribal landowners. Head rig capacity, so that's what the mills could actually take on in the state of Montana, is over 500 million board feet. About 10 years ago, when I started in this industry about 30 years ago, Montana was producing over 1 billion board feet of timber a year. Head rig, even up to like 10 years ago, was about 800 million board feet. So we've gradually decreased, which obviously is not good for Montana's economy, or certainly good for the forest. There's about 760 million primary sales in this industry, 300 million in secondary sales. But back in 2005, which was probably the highlight of the industry in the state, we had over 1.2 billion in sales. That was right before the recession hit. So you can see that we've slowly been coming back up, but honestly, in the last 10 years, this industry has not fully recovered in the state of Montana. Occupation and wages. So we have, we do have good wages in the industry. I'm not going to go through all those, but I will say that now, I go around and I query all the mills every single summer. I go visit everybody that belongs to the association. And last year was the first year that predominantly, it's always about supply. We need timber supply. We always need timber supply. But the one that came up predominantly this last year was workforce. There seems to be a real shortage of workforce, and I think we're hearing that across many, many sectors of the economy in the state of Montana. But we do offer good wages, and they are very actually highly skilled jobs. A lot of it is technical anymore. It's like being on a computer or playing a game. I mean, when you're in the machines or when you're doing this work, it's very, very technical. So as far as the ownership goes, Montana has predominantly federal land in the state as far as the timber goes. About 67% of the timber base in the state of Montana is federally owned. There's only about 5 million acres, actually 7 million acres, that the state owns, but very few of that, about 5% of that is actually timbered. So we really rely on our federal partners a lot to make sure that we can get enough fiber into the mill to make the products that we all use. We also work with tribal lands and non-industrial private landowners, and then the industrial private landowners. So the industrial private landowners are those mills that actually own timberland themselves, and there's about a little over 800,000 acres that are industrial private timber in the state of Montana. Weyerhaeuser, formerly Plum Creek, has been selling off some of their lands. We used to have over 1 million, but we're a little bit over 800,000 now. So Montana harvest levels, you can see, I think the pointer might work, but what the total is. Let's see if they can get that to work. The total timber harvest, this is where the federal is, unfortunately. It's been pretty flat, but it's been pretty low. That's where, like I said, with 67% of the land base and over 12 million acres of available timber, that's where, it's not wilderness, it's not inventoried roadless, it's available timber. That line is what we are constantly working on to try to increase. And there are some constraints with that. And a lot of that has to do because, again, we rely so heavily on the federal side of things. We have a trade agreement that I'll talk about here in a second, the trade agreement with Canada. You probably know that the softwood lumber agreement expired in 2015. We were in a stand down for a year where we couldn't do anything. So in 2016 is when we could finally start filing trade cases, which we have done. But I will speak to that in a little bit. But in the meantime, Canada was definitely dumping a lot of their timber products across the border. Montana shares the largest border with the state of, or with the country of Canada. We grow the same trees, we produce the same products. Our dollar is much stronger than the Canadian currency, and so they can still dump, even with the tariff, they can still dump across the border and still make money. So that definitely has hurt. The tariff and the countervailing duties have come into play now in January, so that's definitely helping. But as far as the federal timber goes, I mean, it's always supply. Like I said, it's always about the supply. The federal budget has definitely decreased. They've been on a sequestration for several years. We've been working on a national level to increase their budget. When I mentioned that 30 years ago, Montana was harvesting over 1 billion board feet, well, on the national level, they are harvesting over 12 billion board feet. And now we're trying to get them up to 4 billion board feet nationally. So I think it's about 3.6 at this point, but we're slowly trying to increase that. There's a lot of rules and regulations that the Forest Service has to follow, a lot of court cases and court precedent that they have to adhere to. It definitely slows down their process, and it's always a challenge. And then there's litigation, and I will speak to that here in a second. But wildfires, while you're here, and a lot of the panelists will speak to you about the effects of wildfire, but this last wildfire season was definitely impacted the industry. We were shut out of the woods for several months, which curtails the supply of raw fiber coming into the mills. If the mills did not have decks in their mill, it would have been tough. There were some that had to shut down some of their and curtail some of their employees while we tried to get through this. But so it definitely is a challenge. Wildfire is a challenge. And then how quickly we can get in and actually do the salvage is another challenge, and I'll speak to that here in a second. Then I already did talk about the workforce. So again, here's a softwood lumber issue, and it's very complicated, and a lot of it is kind of proprietary, and I can't go into a lot, but there was, on the U.S. side did win within the trade office recently and put a countervailing and a tariff back on the Canadian lumber. Like I said, back in 2015 it all expired. It's now back on as of January 1st. In the meantime, though, the Canadian government gave the mills up there just under $900 million for what the impacts were to the industry and not being able to dump over the U.S. border. So they've been subsidized. They're subsidized anyway because they have a different business model than the United States does as far as it is Crown-owned timber. The Crown sets the price. You know, stumpage here in the United States is based on supply and demand, where it's not like that in Canada. So it's definitely a different economics. And without this trade agreement, and I will say it is the longest standing trade agreement the United States has with any country. It goes back to the 1800s. We started having trade agreements with Canada on lumber back in the 50s. I worked on the one when I was working in the Senate in the 90s, and then this one expired in 2016. We don't have a trade agreement yet. We hope to have one, but at this point the tariffs are helping. Then federal timber supply, I talked about that. I mean, it has steadily increased, and I thank Leanne Martin, our regional forester, in the audience because she has an amazing team. It really does depend on the leadership with the Forest Service and our partnership with them to be able to access this federal timber. They can work really, really hard on getting projects moving forward, but unfortunately, Region 1, Missoula, Montana, is the poster child for litigation. So as you can see on that chart there, Region 1, so the numbers across the bottom are the regions. There is no Region 7, so that's why it's not down there. But Region 1 had 72 sales that were litigated. All the other regions, you'd have to go to Washington and Oregon to actually even remotely get close to that. It definitely slows down the pipeline of moving projects forward. If they're litigated, oftentimes there'll be some kind of temporary restraining order or some reason to halt the timber sale process. If a judge makes a decision that's within some aspect that's within the NEPA pipeline, then the Forest Service has to stop everything they're doing and they have to go back through and redo all their NEPA or their environmental analysis. It can take a long time. So this definitely hurts us. We're constantly looking for solutions, judicial reforms in Congress. We're constantly working on that. We're also collaborating with the environmental folks to try to find some common ground and resolve some of these issues. That has helped, but it's certainly not the silver bullet. And then the wildfires. So I'm not going to go into this because I know Jack will talk about it a lot, but this was just a report that was released from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality just late last week. It says that Montana burned just under 1 million acres in 2017, but honestly that's not correct, which is why I haven't posted this on our website yet. We burned 1.2 million acres in the state of Montana. So you can see that Idaho often burns more acres than Montana does, but that's when, just 1 million acres is a lot of timber that has been lost. A lot of landscapes have been lost. A lot of wildlife habitat has been lost. And of course the air quality, which Dr. Ward will talk about. And then if you want to look at the other chart, that one is the air quality. It's not working here. Air quality days, and this is for the year, so it's not just necessarily during the fires, but you can see how many days and how many events that we had that were way over the normal. And that 35, and I'm sorry, I'm not a scientist, and Jack will probably speak to that, but we had worse days than even China has on any given day. We had terrible, terrible air quality this last wildfire season, which obviously impacts everybody, your health, your tourism, everything. But we do have opportunities. Oh, that didn't work out real well. Housing starts and other uses. So we have a great state program, and the acting regional or acting state forester is sitting in the back. Sue Clark is sitting back there with Mike, and speak to some of the state programs. We have a federal salvage program coming up, and we have the Good Neighbor Authority, which is a partnership between the state and the federal and the Forest Service on working on some timberlands together. So construction has definitely gotten better. We are increasing right before the economy went down in 2007. We had about 1.6 million or 6 million housing starts, which is pretty average. It went down to just under 700,000, almost to just above 500,000 during the worst part of the recession. There was a lot of foreclosed houses that we had to get through. We had to get the banks back on track again, but it definitely has come up. So last year we had 1.3 million housing starts. That's between residential and multifamily, which is good. It looks like we need to actually increase that to 24 million within the next next few years. We need to increase that. We need about 1.2 million for the next several years. 44% of their homes by 2030 will need to have more wood fiber. The average home today is 2,200 square feet, where in 1970 was 1,400 square feet. And just so you know, when you see 3 logging trucks going down the road, that's somebody's house. That's what it takes to build a 2,500 square foot house, is about 3 logging trucks. And each and every one of you in this room consumes about 12 pounds of wood fiber a day. Wood uses, there is, in addition to construction, we have all these other wood uses that we actually, in the state of Montana, all participate in. There's companies within the state that are involved in all of these issues. CLT is a cross-laminated timber. That's Smartland up in Whitefish. Every single one of these is something that we are producing within the state of Montana. Then the state program, which I will say, I want to spend a little bit of time on this, and I'm sorry that the Forest in Focus is probably really out of focus, but it's been really a godsend to the industry, and it's coming from the governor's initiative to provide more help in the partnership with the Forest Service and help the state of Montana and also help the timber industry. So even though trust lands only produces about 57 million board feet, which is their sustained yield calculation, which is pretty small compared to what we actually need, the Forestry Division, which is here in Missoula in Spurgeon Road, has provided a lot of programs and fiber and money and help and assistance, and we certainly appreciate that, because without that, I think the industry honestly would be much different today if it had not happened. The Good Neighbor Authority is a partnership that came out of the Farm Bill in 2014, and that allows the state to enter into contracts on Forest Service land to do work and help the Forest Service with their NEPA and everything else. And right now they have about 6 projects planned, which will be about 7 million board feet, but I know that they're working to increase that as well. And then I want to talk about the salvage program, which is my last comment. The Forest Service, and my career has normally taken a couple years to start working on their bear recovering and doing the assessment of the acres. So even though we burned 1.2 million, 700,000 of that was Forest Service lands. They're going to harvest 30,000 acres, gasp, as far as 4%. But here is why. There's many, many filters that are involved in that, and one of the filters is the capacity of the industry. Now, if the industry was working at full capacity, which they're not, we're at about 65% capacity. If we were working at full capacity, we can take about 330 million board feet more, which is where this salvage program is going. But if we had the industry that we had 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we could have taken 800,000 acres, or 800,000, or 800 million, I'm sorry, 800 million board feet of timber. So more of that would have been harvested. And unfortunately, with the stuff that is not going to be harvested, it's dead, it's going to fall down. So I would just say, if you're out recreating, be very careful, because that is how we lost the 2 firefighters this last season, was from snags falling down. So just be careful when you're out there. But the salvage program is underway. I think they have 7 EAs that they're working on, some CEs that are coming on board, which categorical exclusions. They're going to go to the chief and ask for an emergency declaration so they can move forward faster, and hopefully by the end of this summer, we'll actually be out working and salvaging some of this timber, this dead timber, before we lose the value of it. But that's barring that it's not litigated. If it's litigated and we lose the value, then none of it will go. So those are our opportunities where we've come a long way. We're still here. Much of the timber infrastructure in the West is gone. We're lucky. Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, and Oregon still have an infrastructure. Wyoming has some that has come back. It's very capital intensive. Once it's gone, it usually does not come back. Colorado has lost it, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California has all lost their infrastructure. So without the timber infrastructure being here, they're the partner, they're the ones that are going to do the work and process the trees, your fire season will be worse. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. I think there's a couple of messages there. How many people here have a lawn to maintain? All right. Imagine if you did that without a power lawnmower because you didn't have that infrastructure. Now, how many people have ever pushed a lawnmower? How many people have never run a power mower, push lawnmower? So imagine if you had to maintain that without your push lawnmower. It's part of your infrastructure for your maintenance. Imagine you had 12 million acres, right? Imagine you had 12 million acres. And imagine if you didn't have the infrastructure needed to provide stewardship and management of those acres, because that's what's happening here, right? Our timber industry and the capital that's part of that timber industry or mills, as well as our labor, which are skilled millwrights and workers in those mills, is declining and is at risk. Meanwhile, our 12 million acres, right, continues to be at risk because of our past practices and perhaps changes in climate. So Julia was nice enough to give us the current state of timber infrastructure. Julia, thank you very much. What Bryce is going to do is talk to us about the costs of wildfire, and I'll bring him up to the podium in just a second. And then Jack is going to talk to us about the risks of catastrophic wildfire in and around Missoula. So remember the Black Cat fire out at Frenchtown happened 2 different times. That first Black Cat fire, they felt that if the winds would have just been a little bit different and a little stronger out of the west, it would have hopped Highway 93 and taken the North Hills and actually put Missoula in jeopardy. It seemed impossible at the time, but not when you look at the fires in Southern California, right, of this year. And then Tim is going to talk to us about a fascinating topic, how firefighting decisions are made, because we all want to second guess that, all right? So we'll pull this all together for you, and I'll bring Bryce Ward up with a question. Bryce, what is the economic impact of wildfire? Bryce Ward.
Thanks, Nick. It's very convenient that that's what I'm going to talk about. Wow. Anyhow, so as I was trying to get ready to give this talk, I was having some difficulty. It's kind of hard to get your mind into wildfire smoke when it's freezing outside. I'm complaining about like shoveling my driveway and falling on ice. So, you know, complaining about wildfire smoke, that was like 5 months ago. But so anyhow, so what I thought I would do is I thought it would be useful to try and kind of, you know, collectively, where did the clicker go? There. To collectively kind of get our minds back into that wonderful trauma we were experiencing back in August and September. So first, I thought we'd start with just this high-level view. This is this cool map that NASA made. It's a visualization. So all the white stuff, oops, did I turn it off? All the white stuff is smoke. All the white stuff is smoke. Down here you can see the date. It's August 10th, now that's 11th, 12th. Oh, we cleared up for a little bit. That was nice. Got to see the eclipse. Then it's going to start, you know, getting a lot worse. And you know, you'll notice that it's not just the little puffs of smoke that are kind of right around us. The smoke that we get to deal with is coming from all over the place. So it's not just our local fires. Oops. Now I've lost everything.
I'll see if I can take care of it. So move further away.
So, you know, it's not just that now it's getting really bad.
I'll get it.
All right, cool. I'll just talk loud. I'll go back to being a professor. Okay, so, you know, then there's, you know, it finally rained, things got better. So that was what's going, you know, the big picture view of what was going on. If you think more micro, can we switch out? Good. If you think more micro, you know, what was your average day like back when this was all going on? Well, you'd wake up in the morning, you'd look at your phone, you'd see whatever the news alerts were telling you, whatever disaster had happened in Washington over the night. And then you'd, you know, immediately go and you would check this map, and you'd say, oh crap, another bad day. Then you look outside your window and think, well, maybe the map's wrong, and you would know, I guess I'm going to cancel my run or my bike ride or whatever it is I'm going to do. And then you would go to work and you would have the same conversation with every single person that you saw. Ugh, this is terrible. I feel so bad. My throat hurts. My head hurts. When is this going to end? You know, you talk about maybe going off to wherever the green spot on the map was and driving over there for the day. But it wasn't very fun. It was kind of miserable. And this kind of rinse and repeat for basically 6 weeks, right? So that's where we were. Here's what it looks like in graph form, right? So, kind of in July, we're kind of down there below the green line, which means that we had healthy air. And then we kind of moved up, and we thought that was bad. And then we kind of move in and out of the yellow and the red and the orange. And then September happens, and we basically go beyond Beijing for about a week. And then it comes down, and things are great. And that was what was happening here in Missoula. Sealy was just a disaster, right? So, I've scaled this up. They reach Beijing in August 1st and basically never get better. If you look, I actually downloaded all the data from every single air quality monitor in the country for 11 years. The 4 worst days in that period are in that graph. 10 of the worst 25 are in this graph. Of course, it's not just this year, though, right? We deal with this kind of regularly. In fact, if you look at the 100 worst days across that whole period, those 11 years that I downloaded, 36 of them occurred in Montana. 2012, 2015, 2016, 2017, where most of them happened. But if you even take a broader view, right? So I defined this thing and said, look, let's take 30 days worth of air quality monitors, and I'm going to say, okay, did you exceed unhealthy at some point for 25% of those days? Right? So these are all the counties that's happened multiple times over the past 11 years. It's happened 5 times in Valley County. Twice in Missoula, 2015, 2017. Right? So this is not just a one-time thing. This is something that we have to deal with. So the big question then is, so what does this do? How bad is this, right? Now, if you're me, you don't just ask that question. There's a little joke about graduate students that they always end up just doing research on themselves, right? So for instance, a friend of mine who was the king of piracy, right? He downloaded all the music and TV shows. He wrote one of the seminal papers on the effects of music piracy on the music industry, right? I spent a bunch of my time trying to write papers about the economics of dating. You can imagine what that means for my dating life. I never actually got there anywhere with them, but I did create a class where we actually talked about this. That may not have worked out as well either. I did have a student email me once and said, hey Bryce, you'd be happy to know that I used some of the principles in our class when I broke up with my girlfriend. She did not appreciate economics jargon in the breakup speech. She really did not appreciate being told that the opportunity cost of continuing to date her was too high. Michael. Believe it or not, he was the student body vice president at Harvard University. So when I see the smoke outside for a week, I start to say, well, what does this mean? So my first step is to go and say, well, what does the literature say? And I kind of started doing that, and it turns out we actually don't know a whole lot. I'm going to show you what we do know. We actually don't know a whole lot about the effects of wildfire smoke. So the next step is to kind of start gathering at people around the university to say, well, who wants to look at this with me? And so we're in the process of doing that, but I don't have any results of that, so I'm going to tell you what we found from the literature. All right, so if we think about the effects of wildfire broadly, right? We have, of course, the fire effects. Stuff burns. People sometimes die. There's the cost of fighting it. But I'm not going to focus on that because it turns out, at least the evidence that we have suggests that the cost of the smoke is perhaps substantially greater than the cost of the fire, right? And when we think about the cost of smoke, we can break it down into these broad categories: mortality, morbidity, avoidance, behavior, lost output, and then migration. So let's go through those. First, let's talk about mortality. So a lot of times when you die of a heart attack, the standard notion is that you ate too many cheeseburgers, right? But it turns out that air pollution causes a lot of heart attacks, right? In fact, according to the EPA, about 10% of all mortality in Los Angeles County is a result of particulate matter, right? Which is the thing that comes in our smoke, right? So we don't have great studies of the effects of wildfire smoke on mortality in the US. There is one, though, which did find that, of course, that as we expect, wildfire smoke kills people. So there's definitely likely a mortality cost. How big, particularly here, we don't know yet. There's also a morbidity cost. That means that you get sick, right? And if you're unhealthy, you get really sick and have to go to the doctor. We end up spending, a bunch of money on treating you. But even just at a minor level, this is what we all were experiencing, right? So a study that was done based on a Southern California wildfire, they asked people a bunch of questions. About 36% of people in this particular fire event reported ear, nose, and throat symptoms, right? 18% reported breathing problems, 4% reported heart problems, 9% had other health issues, right? So there's definitely other health issues. Then of course, then it was like, okay, well, that's great, or not so great. But that's also not the biggest economic cost. A lot of the biggest economic cost comes from trying to avoid the smoke, right? So if you look at avoidance behavior, right? So what happens? Well, in the same fire, 6% of people evacuated, 7% of people wore face masks, 21% of people got a HEPA filter, 5% of people avoided going to work, 60% of people ran their AC more, and that's a big thing in Montana, right? Is normally you open up your windows, cools down. Maybe if you have AC, if you have it, it runs for a little bit of the day. It was running 24-hour cycles. You stayed indoors, you avoid your normal outdoor recreation 78%. Right? So, when we saw this happen here in Montana, Jeremy Sage and Norman Nickerson over at ITRR, they actually had surveys in the field, so they were able to ask questions about some of this stuff. And here was the response amongst Montanans in terms of the recreation activities, how much more they dropped because of wildfire smoke. Right? It's big effects. So if you take all these kind of health effects together, right? So economists, we're always trying to put a dollar value on everything. It's kind of a sickness, right? But to the extent that we have studies that try and do this, just focusing on the health effects, right? Those sore throats and the hospital stuff. Per smoke day, the two studies that we have an $85 a day estimate and $131 a day. That's how much people would be willing to pay to avoid the health costs of wildfire smoke. Right, but then it doesn't seem like that really captures it all, and just from the health and well-being stuff, because that's there's nothing in there baked in the fact that you didn't go running, or you kind of got maybe a little depressed, you're a little sadder. So another different paper that came out just last fall estimated that's $373 a day in health and well-being. That's how much people would be willing to pay to avoid one day of wildfire smoke. So if we just take the 115,000 people in Missoula County and multiply that number, it's $43 million a day of economic cost and well-being, right, from a day of wildfire smoke. Right? So do that across 6 weeks, get a pretty big number. Of course, that's not all where all the economic costs come in. We also have lost productivity, right? So, we know that, I can tell you, my sister didn't come visit Montana this summer because of wildfire smoke. In fact, Jeremy and Norma at ITR also did research on this. They found that 9% of people who had planned to come to Montana did not come to Montana as a result of wildfire smoke. Right? So 9% of our big, giant tourism economy is non-trivial, several $100 million. Right? But even those who came had different experiences. Their experience was affected, and there may be ultimately long-term effects from this, from the fact that people didn't have as much of a good time, maybe they don't come back later. So we'll have to follow that long term. But we also just lose productivity, right? I showed you a little bit some of the avoidance behaviors. People don't go to work, right? And what we find, in fact, there's this new study, it's a working paper, but it's a new study which ultimately finds that, wildfire smoke is somewhat exogenous, so we can look and see what happens to the economy in places where it's smoky. And what they find is that income magically drops. Right? And then what drives that drop is a couple of things, right? So one is that there's some people who just don't work, right? Particularly professional services people who, it's like, I don't want to go sell at home today, or I don't want to go write a report today. So that part drops. But it actually lasts for about 18 months, and you see this kind of prolonged reduction in labor force participation, which they interpret as a long-term health effect. And ultimately what they find is that if you take the whole country in a typical wildfire year, $100 billion of lost income due to the productivity effects of wildfire smoke, right? So I think Nick said something like they spend $3 billion a year fighting fires. Well, we're losing $100 billion a year in output because of air pollution is really bad. Air pollution is really bad, right? It has health effects, has all sorts of stuff, and it's really bad for the economy. So we have this big effect. And then, of course, the longer term effect that we don't know yet, right? But there is some research that looks at hurricanes and earthquakes and other natural disasters, they didn't include wildfires, which suggests that this may have a migration effect, right? That people may ultimately decide, you know what, I'm not sure I want to live in that place anymore, right? And so we lose people and we lose economic capacity that way, which is another thing we'll be tracking over the long term, right? So the costs of wildfire are pretty big. The question then is, well, what do we do? Right? I don't know what to do because I'm an economist, not a forester, but I can tell you the basic structure that we need to look at, right? So if you think about fire and how bad is it, well, you got 4 components. You got the spark, right? So most of the time that's lightning. We don't got that's going to happen, whether we want it to or not. But there are some human-caused fires, so don't be stupid. So that's the way to deal with that. Second, on the fuel side, right? So you have spark. Well, you need to have something for it to burn. That's where a lot of the stuff that I think people talk about is how much fuel is left in the forest due to suppression activity, due to changes in harvesting practices. So there's ultimately a large discussion about, well, what kind of fuel should we leave in the forest? And of course, then there's the climate, right? So, sparks and fuel are always in the forest, and yet we don't end up with the big forest fires every year. So what also changes? Well, when it's 90 degrees every day and doesn't rain for 2 months, the climate matters, and you end up with a big fire season. So obviously, we have to think about what's happening with the climate. And then the last, of course, is suppression. The whole decision about, which Tim's going to talk about, is where to fight, how to fight, how much to fight, ultimately also matters. And so I was supposed to actually end with another slide, but I forgot to put it in here, telling you to come back next Friday. I'll be standing over there, or maybe right here, I don't know. At the BBR's annual Economic Outlook Tour, talking about the future of higher education. So Todd and my coworkers back there, I was supposed to have a slide in here. Just tell Pat that it was there. And everybody else agreed to that. Bryce showed the slide. Come to the Economic Outlook Tour in 10 days. Back to Nick.
All right. Thank you very much, Bryce. It always amazes me when we have these State of Missoula, how much information each of the speakers can provide. And from my own experience, and I'm looking over there at Jerry Marks from the Extension Agent, I will tell you that Jerry and I both have really healthy hearts. So either smoke turns your hair white or it affects your heart, and one of the two. So, all right, Mr. Jack Cohen, would you talk to us about the risks of catastrophic wildfire in and around Missoula? Come on up. We'll get you set up here.
Is that as annoying to you as it is to me? Okay. It's up. Good. Thank you. So, my primary topic here is going to be homes destroyed in very large numbers during extreme wildfires. So that's the primary topic. But I've got really 3 points here. And before I can get into talking about the opportunities we have for not having houses destroyed, we need to understand at least a little bit about the wildfire context. Now, we just heard a lot about smoke and the adverse effects of smoke. Our initial reaction might be, well, we'll just do away with wildfires. But there is nothing historically and currently indicative that says we're going to get rid of wildfires. So my first point is wildfires are inevitable. Secondly, we need to recognize that historically, fire occurrence in our landscapes is what is responsible for the development and the maintenance of the ecosystems Europeans found when they got here. So all of the values that we somewhat take for granted with regard to our forests and rangelands, that developed after the last ice age with fire as a principal component of that development. And then thirdly, and maybe mostly to the point, we don't necessarily have to have home destruction and wildland urban fire disasters during the extreme wildfires that are inevitable. We actually have opportunities to do something about this problem, to actually separate home destruction from wildfire and attempted control of wildfire. That gives us lots of opportunities. So let's look very briefly at the context of wildfire. So fire is inevitable. We can find that in regard to both human as well as lightning ignitions have occurred for thousands of years. We also need to face the fact that since its inception, fire suppression has failed in controlling wildfire at initial attack 2 to 5% of the time. That's from the very inception. So there aren't any good old days with regard to fire control. We're basically just spending more today with higher technology to largely maintain the same level of success, which we often tout as 95 to 98%, but that's not where our problems are with regard to our aversity to fire. It's in that continual failure rate. So we're dealing with extreme wildfire inevitability. We're also need to face the fact that since the end of the Ice Age, fire has been a principal disturbance factor in the development of our ecosystems, most North American ecosystems, and that's in spades in our own location in western Montana. However, since European discovery and settlement, we have dramatically reduced the amount of fire occurrence in our landscapes. So let's get an idea of what that means. So the average since 2005 to 2015 of the total area burned in the lower 48, well, actually, in this case, we're talking about Alaska as well. So the total amount of acreage burned is about 9.6 million acres per year. That's mostly wildfire, but also includes prescribed fire. If we look at the estimate of what would naturally occur, what naturally occurred given a correction for our current land use, we would be looking at about 44 to 105, 106 million acres per year burned. So when we're looking at our current average acreage burned, it is almost 10 times less than what burned before. So that means we need more fire. Well, but the key here is the fires that historically occurred mostly under different conditions. It wasn't just under the extreme conditions that foils our attempted fire control. So most historically, fires spread during less than extreme conditions. Why would that be? Because most conditions aren't extreme. Most conditions are moderate when fires can spread, historically and now. But fire suppression has largely eliminated wildfires that historically burned during moderate to high weather conditions. Those are the conditions under which we are most successful. So particularly in the western US, ecologically significant wildfires now largely occur during the extreme burning conditions due to severe weather and very dense continuous vegetation. So let's look at the influence of suppression, just as an example. So this forest, which is in the Bitterroot, historically burned about every 10 to 15 years. We know that through fire history studies. If we look at the last 80 years, we find that not only has the stand increased its density, but it also shifted the species that's occupied that. Now, instead of big yellow pine, ponderosa pine, now it's encroached on by smaller Douglas fir. If we look historically, this is the Black Hills of South Dakota in 2000. We see this particular site. And if we look then at pre-settlement, pre-mining, this is the Custer expedition in 1874, we see a considerably less dense, a more patchy kind of landscape. This is the result of both our land use behavior as well as our attempted exclusion. If we look at the longer range or the longer term, the longer interval of fires in western Montana, it's mostly upper elevation. Basically, we're looking at forests that naturally burn with higher intensities, the intensities that scare the hell out of us. But what we see historically is not the very large continuous burning that occurs now under the extreme conditions. So we're faced with a wildfire paradox. Our management policy of wildfire exclusion and control has increased the potential for more intense and extensive wildfires during extreme conditions. We're actually working against ourselves in this regard. And these are the extreme fire conditions when wildland urban fire disasters occur. In fact, it's the only time that wildland urban fire disasters occur. So here's the reality summary. Wildfires during extreme conditions are inevitable. Wildland fire during appropriate conditions is a factor for sustaining most ecosystems now, requiring more fire, not less. So does that mean that wildland urban fire disasters are inevitable? And my answer to that is absolutely not. So let's take a look and see if we can begin to get a clue as to how the disasters, the residential fire disasters are occurring. So what we see in this scene are typical patterns of destruction. That is total destruction surrounded by unburned vegetation. Notice that this is not a continuous burn pattern, and where the tree canopies are actually burned is because the structures were burning, not the other way around. So we look at this scene, 1993, Laguna, California. I pick California frequently because it's the best bad example I can use. And we see one house in this scene that survived, and it survived without protection. Why without protection? Because this was an untenable, a very unsafe place to be when this community was burning. Now, this later became known as the Miracle House. And the question becomes one of what else didn't burn in this scene? Yeah, exactly. Miracle vegetation. Too frequently, when we see photos like this, we look at the total destruction and completely miss what hasn't burned in that location. More than 80% of the time in the investigations that I've done, homes are surrounded by unconsumed vegetation, meaning that it's low intensity surface fire and or firebrands, burning embers that have lofted in to ignite the houses, not some continuous high intensity tsunami of flame. When we look at this, 1980 in Southern California, we see 2 houses burning in this scene and not the vegetation. These homes ignited from lofted burning embers, which either ignited directly on the house or immediately surrounding it that put flames on the house. The bottom line, it's the little things that ignite these houses. We look at Los Alamos in 2000, total destruction surrounded by, in this case, green vegetation. Down the street from where that first scene was, we see again the same thing. So let's take a look at this neighbor at this particular street where these 2 houses were in video. And what do we see? We see nothing but houses burning. In fact, the Cerro Grande fire that initiated all of this has since ceased its activity 2.5 hours earlier than this video. And what we see are houses burning, and we see it looking through unburning canopies. By the way, the helicopter pilot was also doing this video, and he's still alive. Bob Martin is still a guy that I admire. So let's take a look quickly at scenes of either houses burning to total destruction in this process without high-intensity exposures. One after another. This is the 2009 Victoria fires just up the hill from Melbourne in 2009. 173 fatalities occurred on this fire, civilian fatalities, and we see the same patterns in this fire as we do in all of these kinds of residential associated fires. Waldo Canyon, there are only houses burning here. In this particular case, the wildfire had gone by, it entered the community, it burned to the community, a surface fire, but it was lofting, burning embers into the community, a very high density suburb, and this is the result. We look at Roaring Canyon, the Roaring Lion fire. and we see the same kind of patterns. So what does unconsumed vegetation in homes adjacent to total destruction indicate? It indicates that intense simultaneous heating from intense wildfires is not occurring at the structures. Basically, we're looking at local conditions, conditions very local to the structure that are the conditions that determine the ignition and total destruction. When we see a scene like this, which is the Roaring Lion fire, it is extremely counterintuitive to us to not see that initial scene and think that that wildfire is all-consuming. It's not at all all-consuming. Even that kind of scene of a very large convection column and an extended perimeter of big flames, which emotes a great deal of fear and anxiety in us, is not capable of igniting homes from long distances from flames. Now, what you should be getting here is at least a question of, well, if it's not this tsunami of flame that's going through communities igniting, maybe this gives us an opportunity to do something about those local conditions. So wildfire doesn't spread through a community like a flash flood or a tsunami that explodes houses and leaves total destruction in its wake. And this kind of destruction, total destruction, is not due to a high-intensity exposure. You're looking through what used to be 4 houses into the forest. It was the little things that ignited these houses. So although intense wildfires initiate the ignitions through firebrands and then surface fires that are ignited by firebrands, that's what it typically ignite the homes. And commonly communities burn by fire spreading through residential fuels, the vegetation of structures within the community. Homes ignite and burn hours after significant wildfire activity. All the investigations I've done, primarily most of the houses are burning for hours after the wildfire has ceased its significant activity in that general area. The community continues to burn without the wildfires. If we take a look at this photo, 2.5 hours earlier is when the wildfire spread to the edge of the community. If we look a half a mile into the community, we see that it's continuing to burn 2.5 hours after the wildfire ceased its significant activity at the edge of the community. If we look closer in that yellow rectangle, we see houses burning on either side, further away and closer. If we even look closer, what we see are small ignitions which eventually totally destroyed those houses. And in the eventuality, at the end, there wasn't a single house that survived within this scene. 12 hours later. So if it's the little things that are igniting the houses, where are our firefighters? What are they doing? Well, that's kind of a loaded question. Being a firefighter, I'm not going to ask that question to self-deprecate. So let's look at the sequence on how these disasters develop. We're looking at severe conditions, the fuels available, the weather conditions like no rain in July in Missoula, and the topography. And then given an ignition, we end up with extreme fire behavior. And then with that extreme fire behavior, rapid growth, high intensities that can loft burning embers into ignition vulnerable houses, we end up with simultaneous houses burning. Now, what we pay our taxes for, because I frequently get this, well, I pay my taxes for fire suppression. Well, you don't pay your taxes to suppress hundreds of houses exposed to ignition. You don't pay your taxes for entire blocks of houses burning at the same time. You pay your taxes for a response to a single house or a single structure burning. Okay? So now we have multiple houses burning at the same time. In fact, when I was in California, also doing operations, it was not unusual for one engine crew to have 25 houses to protect. And what that does is it completely overwhelms. So the extreme wildfire conditions overwhelm the suppression capabilities, and the multiple ignitions, the very broad thousands of houses exposed is overwhelming the fire protection. And that means many, many houses go unprotected that have ignited, and they burn to total destruction without any attention to produce the disaster. Let's recall, fire suppression fails 2 to 5% of the time during these extreme conditions. 2 to 5% of the fires that occur can't be suppressed at initial attack. And what that does is any ignition on a house ends up being unprotected and burns to total destruction. That's how the little things are ending up with total destruction. So our principal methods for preventing wildland urban fire disasters are these, and they fail during the fire conditions when disastrous home destruction occurs. The inevitability of extreme wildfire conditions and our inability to control extreme wildfires suggests inevitable wildland urban fire disasters. However, home ignition during extreme wildfires is primarily determined, and I want to stress, under the extreme conditions, is primarily determined by local conditions of the structure and its immediate surroundings. So if we don't plan for the extreme conditions, we might as well not plan for anything, because already we're handling the lesser than the extreme conditions with our 90%, 98% success rate. So it's only when the failure occurs that we're having this problem. We're primarily spending billions on this 2%. So let's go back to the sequence, and what if we have houses? I'm not going to pursue the notion of suddenly nobody's going to live within an exposure distance of wildfire. That's not going to happen. So what if the houses are ignition resistant and we don't have the simultaneous ignitions? That means we don't overwhelm our protection, which means that we can address the ignitions that do occur, and that means we don't have disasters. So basically, if homes don't ignite, homes don't burn, and if homes don't burn, the wildland urban fire disaster doesn't occur. Aren't you glad you came for lunch on that one? So why don't we consider this problem a home ignition problem instead of a wildfire control problem? In one case, we have the option to deal with that problem, the home ignition problem. We don't have a choice over excluding wildfire. So inevitable wildfires would occur without necessarily having wildland urban fire disasters if we address the home ignition problem. So the question is, can we prevent home ignitions during extreme wildfires? And the obvious answer from my standpoint is yes. So a little bit of the fire research. The modeling, experiments, and examinations that I did determined that the characteristics of a home in relation to its immediate surroundings within 100 feet of the house principally determine home ignitions during extreme wildfires. And I call this the home ignition zone, or the HIZ. This is an example of, not a model for, that determination. We're looking at relatively new construction of ignition-resistant design and materials. A high-intensity crown fire came this way and basically did not ignite that structure. Let's take an example look at at some fires we did experimentally that go along with that, that help to show that. So here we are in Northwest Territories doing our experimental crown fires. Each plot was about 5¼ acres in size, and these are the crown fires we produced. Very high intensity. And exposed to those wildfires, you'll see in a moment, wall sections like this. So I constructed wall sections and placed them at 33 feet from the forest edge of that experimental plot at 66 and 98 feet, 10, 20, and 30 meters. There were all kinds of experiments that went on during these studies. You can see now real-time firebrands igniting spot fires within this fuel break. The debris that was in the fuel break. This wall section has been cleared around about 2 feet because flame contact is a no-brainer. So the camera's in a specially prepared box at the edge of the plot. As you saw previously, the crown fire comes up to the end, and we have an unignited wall section. So from the crown fires, the 33-foot wall section failed to ignite 3 out of the 7 times that it was done, and there was no significant scorch at 66 feet. Basically, this is where this was part of the support for this notion of 100 feet around the house as being the extent of the home ignition zone. So here's an example of where the wildfire is not coming in to the communities and how that occurs. So we're looking at crown fire coming into the edge of the community. This is the first residential street of this community, and clearly it's a no-brainer. If you've got crown fire coming into where the structures are, it's going to ignite. Interestingly enough, the width of this street from canopy to canopy is about 40 feet at the gap, and yet total destruction of structures on both sides of the road. The first line on the right, and for another 3 blocks going in. So what contributed to the ignition of the rest of the community? Firebrands, igniting directly on the structures, igniting spot fires that then spread continuously in order to contact the structure with surface fire. So firebrands that cause ignitions commonly travel a half a mile or more during extreme wildfire conditions, depending on the type of vegetation that's burning. And once the community starts burning, the burning structures and the adjacent vegetation that ignite from the structures are significant sources of firebrands within the community. Let's take a look at a demonstration of how this can occur without any flame contact from the wildfire. So here's a demonstration at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety Research Center in South Carolina, where we generated very realistic short-range firebrand blizzards. We put pine needles along the base, as well as bark mulch, as well as pine needles in the valleys. This is a composition shingle roof. We loaded the gutters, vinyl, aluminum, and vinyl with pine needles, very common to the debris that you'll find on and around many, many of our houses, whether in suburbs next to wildlands or within the wildlands. This is real time, and what we see here is within 40 seconds, we have very active fire making contact with the structure. We have the potential for fire at the eave to ignite the eave boards, the fascia, as well as the subsheathing of the roof to go into the attic, all of that. And eventually this house ignited and we had to suppress it. This is all inside the research lab. So understanding how homes ignite during extreme wildfire shows us how local ignition conditions of the HIZ principally determine home ignitions. By eliminating ignition vulnerabilities within the HIZ, we can prevent home destruction and wildland urban fire disasters. However, here's the trick. HIZs are typically private property. So homeowners have the principal authority, but not the principal responsibility by today's social structure for reducing their home's ignitability. Right now, we depend on fire services. In fact, we don't depend on, we demand the impossible from our fire services. So homeowners must take, this isn't a moralistic statement on my part, it is an administrative statement. Homeowners must take responsibility for and engage in reducing their home's ignitability to effectively prevent wildland urban fire disasters. Making our homes ignition resistant means having extreme wildfires without wildland urban fire disasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jack. Tim, you want to come up? So Tim Love is going to talk to us a little bit about how firefighting decisions are made and are there opportunities for greater local participation. So as we sit in the Missoula community and we watch the Lolo fire ignite for the second time in a few years, the question we have is, why did they let that burn, right? And so I think Tim has all the answers to that question. Mr. Tim Love. You're on.
We're up. So this is a question that is asked over and over and over again every fire season, how decisions are made and who are making those decisions. And so this first image, I want to put this in context because it's very important, and people often say it didn't used to be like this. We used to catch these fires. We didn't have large fires, and things have changed, and certainly they have changed. And we have a changing fire environment, and that's what I want to talk about. For the sake of time, I'll go ahead and just talk, and hopefully the images will come up. But between 2000 and 2017, Montana wildfires burned over 7 million acres, destroyed over 12,000 structures, most of these being outbuildings, and suppression costs since then have exceeded $1.5 billion, and that's in Montana. But that does not include damage to homes, property, fences, livestock losses, pasture, and the like. So the fire environment has changed a lot, and it's changed in my career with the Forest Service. I watched that change. What are the reasons for that? What's happened? Well, you know, you hear about it all the time in the news. We have warmer and drier conditions, and people can debate why that is, but it is. There's declines in the snowpack, especially at lower elevations. There's earlier runoff than we used to see. And there's changes in the fuel complex quite a bit due to fire suppression, because we were so effective at suppressing fires after 1910 that more forests have grown. There are more stems, more trees per acre, and we're dealing with a lot more fuel. And there's increases in insect and disease problems. If you live in western Montana, you can't help be aware of that. Is that better? So I have pictures that show those changes in a dramatic way. So just imagine what that must look like. And we have we have people living in the forest now. In the past, not so much. And so we have this urban interface issue, and it's real. Fires from the 40s to the 80s, a 5,000 acre fire was considered to be very large. We called them project fires. And when I started with Forest Service, you know, a fire that was over 100, 200 acres was a big deal because we were catching them at a much smaller size. Mega fires, fires that were over 100,000 acres, were rare. I think you could count maybe 5, Marble Cone being one in California. You just didn't hear them, and when they happened, it was incredible. Active fire seasons were about 4 to 7 years apart, and in the Northern Rockies, about 7 years is what I recall. Fire seasons usually started in July and ended in August. Remember the August singularity, we moved the fair because of that. And soon after that was a season-ending event, a storm, a rain that lasted and put down enough moisture that pretty well wrapped up the fire season. Fires were less complex then. There were fewer people living in or near the forest than today, and you know, you have all seen that change. Firefighting in the 40s and to the 80s was there was a 10 a.m. policy that all fires were supposed to be suppressed, if possible, by 10 o'clock the next day. So if you had lightning come through, starting fires in the afternoon, you got on those fires, the goal was by 10 o'clock the next day, they should be controlled. Night firefighting was common. We did it all the time. Initial attack was 97 to 98% effective. Incident management teams or fire teams at the time were usually responsible for one large fire when it happened. There were more incident management teams than there are today, especially the Type 2. There's still Type 2, Type 1 teams in the Northern Rockies, but that's been at the expense of Type 2 teams because you're drafting those people and those resources so you can stand up those Type 1 incident management teams. And most of the teams were composed of agency personnel. We'll try to catch up. So here's a slide that talked about changes that I mentioned. What's changed? Here's some of those photographs that show what's happened because of fire suppression. We have a lot more trees today. If you looked around Missoula, and you look at old photographs of Missoula, Averill Hill, the Rattlesnake, Patty Canyon, you would see far fewer trees, or Dean Stone Mountain, than you'll see today. And this is why that's changed. Here's some other photographs that show that example. It's been pretty dramatic. Fires from, again, that was a large fire. Those were rare. Those were the seasons, usually through that period of time, less complex. Catching up to where I'm at, initial attack, more incident management teams, and mostly agency personnel. So, from the late 80s to the present. So here's the comparison and the contrasting of what's happened. 50,000 acre fires today are not uncommon. Mega fires are not uncommon. Well, let me go back. 50,000 acre fires are common. Mega fires are not uncommon today. According to the information we had available, there are 172 since 1999. Those are huge fires by anyone's standard. Fires are more complex because there's more people living near and in forest and around forest. Active fire seasons in the Northern Rockies, you'll remember some of these years. 88, of course, was a huge fire season. It's when Yellowstone was burning. 91 was a late fire season. It was in October. The October surprise, they called it. 94, 96, 2000, getting a little closer. All the fires that happened in the Bitterroot was in 2000, 2003. That was the Black Mountain Fire. There were several fires in 3. 7, of course, that was Jocko Lakes and numerous other fires. 12 was active, 15 was active, 17 was active. Fire frequency is just coming on faster and faster. It went from that 7 years to that. And the severity has increased. Fire seasons now run late, spring through September. and sometimes even into October. You can see large fire growth in the fall. So changes in firefighting, and this is starting to get at the heart of what's happened. Night firefighting is less common today than it used to be, and that is safety related. And I can tell you from personal experience, the most frightened I have been on a fire is at night when things are coming out of that fire and you're down slope and you can't see it. And you know, it's kind of terrifying. And for a lot of reasons, we've tried to reduce exposure to firefighters in those circumstances. There are multiple objectives. Of course, full suppression used to always be the way it was. Limited suppression, we do more of that. We have to, and I'll get into that. And then no suppression. Even in fires that you proclaim as wildfire, especially backcountry fires, you know, your intentions and your plans are to put those fires out, but frankly, there are no resources to put those fires out. They're fighting fires in the front country, where people live, where values are at risk. There's only so many firefighting resources available, and you get overwhelmed at times. We're still highly successful, though, at 96%. There are fewer incident management teams, and they manage more fires. Now you're managing complexes of fires. The Sapphire Complex last year is a good example. There were 3 fires that incident management team was responsible for. The Rice Ridge Fire incorporated the Liberty Fire. So you have more fires going on, and one team is trying to manage those events. There are fewer agency firefighters, especially what we call the reserves. 50% of the team personnel are now made up of retirees like me. You go out on fire assignment. You keep your qualifications so you can go like the reserves and help. There's more contract firefighters, more apparatus, and more expensive. So, dealing with these changes, there's a real competition for limited resources. There's a limited number of crews, overhead, aircraft, and support personnel. And you all know the budget has taxed the state and the nation to the limits. We had a special legislative session last year in part because of the cost of firefighting. And then the loss of revenue from people not coming into the state, as Dr. Ward had mentioned. The Forest Service, of course, is the trying to deal with fire borrowing. That is, if you understand it, you're taking money from some sources that you would use to manage the forest, and you're putting it into fire suppression. It's very expensive, and it comes at the cost of your other resource programs. Firefighter and private citizen safety has been heightened because of the sheer presence in the need to protect lives. And decision-making is more complex. And it's not easily understood because if you're not in the business and you're not close to it, you're just not familiar with how those decisions are made. And even maybe who's making those decisions. So it's an important message that we try to explain, oftentimes during an incident, when you're working with people. So here's roughly how decisions are made. It's based on, you don't have pre-planning in advance. You have forest plans. You have unit fire plans that are updated on an annual basis. So you know when you're going into a fire season what resources you have available, who's responsible for dispatching, and what priorities are going to be made. Fire management unit gives priority based on values at risk, always has. It's a triage situation. And you know, it's not hard to understand if you get overwhelmed by a dry lightning event, you only have so many people, you're going to fight so many fires, and the ones you're going to pick are the ones where people are at more at risk. And the others, you know, may sit there for a few weeks before you can get people on them. Each fire incident goes through a dispatch system. That is all in place, and the resources that are available when a fire is detected. So here we go at initial attack. Happens all the time, routinely. Most people don't even know that's happening. But if a lightning storm comes through that starts a lot of fires, and you're out there putting them out, may not see the smoke. Air Patrol has seen it, or a lookout tower has seen it, and you've dispatched resources to go catch it. Each unit, and because of my Forest Service background, I'll stick with that pretty much, but like a ranger station has fire organizations. State, the NRC has the same thing. BLM and Air Protection has the same, so is the tribes. And you go with that organization, your crews, your engines, your resources that you have available to you to go attack those fires, one or several at the same time, and manage them. And again, we're really successful. The agencies have been very successful at doing that. Local units have incident commanders qualified up to type 3. And, 5 being the less complex fire, a 4 and 3. A 2 is a team. You're bringing in a team. But I won't go into all those nuances. But at the unit level, you have people that are qualified to engage in those fires. It can be somewhat complex and deal with them, and they do. I use this example. At Sealy Lake, we have an average 20 to 25 fires annually, and we catch them. And the district ranger is responsible for that, working for the forest supervisor with the resources that you have available and the support you have available to you. You're making the decision and catching those fires. So an extended attack. Okay, now we're going into a long-term campaign fire. This is what gets everybody's attention. That's a fire that escapes initial attack. The resources you have available to you, you're not able to catch the fire. It's going to get big, and you may hold on to it for a few days, maybe 3 or 4 with what resources you have available. But when it becomes clear to me that we're not going to catch this thing and we're having real candid talks with our fire management people, it's time to call in for resources and order a team, because you need that level and that depth of support. You need other resources to manage that. Again, it's the line officer, or we use the parlance agency administrator, the person responsible. And you do more analysis of the event. You do a risk assessment, severity. You run some analysis on what this fire could come to and what it might look in the future. You evaluate your decisions on a daily basis. You incorporate information from your briefing and planning. You work with your incident management team, your incident commanders, and the agency administrator is that person who's responsible, typically a forest supervisor at this level. You involve all your fire protection agencies because you're in a unified command, oftentimes state, tribal, federal agencies, local government, organizations like Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Northwest Energy, Department of Transportation, those that are affected by the event, and local residents. And that's often done during team briefings where you're talking to the public and other interested parties. Incident management teams, type 1 and 2, are highly trained in fire tactics. They apply appropriate fire tactics based on directives provided by the agency administrator. They provide daily coordination and feedback to the agency administrator so they know what's going on. And points to ponder, fire is a part of our ecosystem. It always has been and it always will be. We have a place in managing our fires. We can be reactive, and we will, and suppress fires, but we need to be proactive and manage fuels as well. We understand the consequences of our choices. Protecting lives will be right at the top. We make decisions with the best information available. There are many factors to consider in a dynamic environment, and that's to say the least. And sometimes there are serious and unwanted consequences, unfortunately. There's risk to that business. So final point, there are 3 factors that influence fire behavior: fuels, weather, topography, and fuel is the only factor that we have any control over. Strategically, tactically appropriate fuels treatments can help protect lives, property, and natural resources. And I want to give my thanks to Byron Bonney, who helped me put this together. And with that,
Great. Thank you very much. I know it's 1 o'clock, but are there any questions? Burning questions? Yeah, Ron?
Question for Tim, please. Tim, the Forest Service historically, at the local level has relied on the concept of mobilizing the militia. And in the last 10 to 15 years, with the significant reductions in personnel, particularly at the local level and district level, can you quantify what effect that's had on the concept of mobilizing the militia, particularly for initial attack?
There's probably several answers to that. It is because of the nature of firefighting. You have to have qualifications, skills to do that work. And so you have to put a lot of effort and energy into training. And it's hard to keep those qualifications. You have to go out on assignments, there's a lot to it. So that is a challenge in itself. When people lose qualifications, they lose skills, and they're not available. And I think more than anything, it is those militia, those reserve resources that we once had available to the agency to come in and support those suppression activities that are fewer today. That's for sure. And some of that has to do with qualifications, and some of it has to do with they're engaged in their responsibilities. But does that answer your question?
One more question. No more questions. So we started. Ooh. Oh.
Come on, Kaufman.
How could I forget you? Melissa.
Thank you. So this is the state of Missoula, and this is a little bit of a bleak picture of more fires, more intense fires. A question for anyone who wants to answer it. From your perspective, what can Missoula as a community do to protect ourselves, be it our health, our air quality, our economy, damage to properties? So a question for anyone or everyone.
Well, I'll give a quick response. Missoula is about ready to release its Missoula Wildfire Community Protection Plan. And I think that people should be engaged in that when it's rolled out later this month is the schedule. And that is a way for the community to look at what can be done and provide feedback and support for that. It would be, I know, much appreciated by those that are doing work.
I'll give a quick answer. The people I did research with are all public health people. And what we started down is that in most communities, we don't think of the smoke just happens. But there are real public health consequences to it, and we need to build our infrastructure and prepare and actually kind of, look, the smoke's going to happen. The question is how do we adapt it and deal with it? And, we have the cloud and urban interface, and we have the firefighting. So from the health perspective and the economic perspective this is our natural disaster. They're happening, they're going to happen. We just have to build up the infrastructure to actually be prepared to manage them in a way that reduces the economic impact.
So I'll end. Be involved at the state and the local level and at the federal level. So again, a lot of these fires are on federal lands, and we need to be paying attention because oftentimes when the fire is happening and it affects your pocketbook or your ability to breathe, people pay attention, but as soon as they go out, people forget. And other issues like immigration and taxation and everything else kind of come to the forefront, and these issues go away, but they're not gone away. There's a lot of pieces of legislation moving forward. So I would just hope that you will stay engaged and be educated and step in and have your voice heard.
I think the number one way to deal with wildfire is to get real, to start facing the realities and start losing our misperceptions and illusions that somehow or another we can exclude and control. I think we need to recognize the realities of ecological fire, and I'm not talking about some save the planet kind of notion. I'm talking about the human quality of life with regard to maintaining our ecosystems in a resilient fashion. Many of the benefits we get are non-short-term commodity kinds of benefits. And so we need to incorporate that economically, I think, with regard to how we spend our money and how we begin to take an approach of compatibility to the inevitability rather than the illusion of control.
Any other questions? Any other questions? All right, we started with Smokey the Bear, we'll end, excuse me, Smokey Bear, we'll end with Smokey Bear. My apologies. If you've ever seen a forest with a fire running wild, and you love the things within it, like a mother loves her child, then you do what Smokey tells you when he tells you to beware. Don't beware. Be aware. I want to thank today our sponsors. First Interstate Bank, who's the primary sponsor, our visionary members, First Security Bank, the Missoula and University of Montana, Northwestern Energy, AT&T. Have a wonderful, safe afternoon. Enjoy the sunshine. And from the Chamber of Commerce, Missoula, Montana, thank you all. A warm round of applause for our speakers, please.